Okay. Let me first share the YouTube live on Twitter first. Then we're going to be starting in a couple of minutes. Okay. Also, I'm going to activate, our university session, of course.
You are currently the only person in this conference.
Okay. Let me finish my preparations first, then we're going to be jumping into the session. All right, welcome everyone. This is fourth year undergraduate course, current international issues at the University of, Izmir, Katip Celebi University. Today what we're going to do is to talk about neoclassical realism and, the three images of Ken Waltz and how it started afterwards and how it differentiates from neorealism, and whether it is as good as it claims to explain world affairs, especially in the post-Cold War era. Then in the second session, we're going to be probably have a closed session. Now we're not going to have a YouTube broadcast in which I'm going to give you an example of an article presentation about Russia's changing Baltic policy from a neoclassical realist perspective. And then from next week, we're going to be listening to you guys presenting articles assigned to you previously. Okay. Neoclassical realism. Well, it dates back to late 1990s, to be specific, 1998. When the person on the picture, Gideon Rose, the editor of Foreign Affairs magazine, first coined the term neoclassical realism in his review article with the ultimate objective of refining neorealism, which was suffering from some sort of legitimacy crisis after the Cold War era. Well, because the prominent neorealist scholars, they failed, in a sense, to predict the end of the Cold War, okay? Therefore, the post-Cold War era was very chaotic and so many different dynamics, requiring kind of a refinement in the main assumptions of realist theory. And Gideon Rose became the flag bearer of neo-realist tradition, let's say, to refine neorealism in order to make it capable to answer to the new challenges in world politics today. So in order to increase the explanatory capacity of neorealism. Therefore, it is not something very different from neorealism. It is not distinct actually from neorealism. It is just a different wing, a different version of it, which aims to emphasize individual and domestic factors, as well as systemic factors when we're talking about international relations, okay? So the main aim is to refine neorealism by incorporating domestic factors into IR, okay? Also, he talks about this, he has this very famous motto, bringing back state into international relations. So re-emphasize the importance of state level factors. So what's happening inside the state, what's happening inside the government, right? The economic and political and military capabilities and the developments in regards to them actually help us better understand why states act in such a certain way in order to survive under international anarchy. Therefore, he doesn't deny the fact that the world is anarchic. Okay, the neoclassical realism accepts the number one argument of neorealism. International system is anarchical. Okay, states try to operate and they try to survive under international anarchy. But how they do it might be dependent on individual and domestic factors. This is the main point of difference between neoclassical and neorealism. Therefore, it doesn't aim to replace neorealism, but try to make it stronger so that it better explains today's world politics. Well, in that regard, neoclassical realism rejects the neorealist argument that agents, units, for instance, states, individuals, or region type. Well, neorealism claims that they are somewhat unimportant or of secondary importance. Okay, well, because we're all operating under international anarchy. So our region type, it doesn't necessarily matter. As long as you have the military capabilities to survive, then it's fine. Whether you are a democracy, whether you are an illiberal regime, whether you are a dictatorship, it doesn't matter, well, because every state aims to survive under international anarchy. Therefore, the neorealist idea at the back of their mind is that, well, all domestic factors, they come of, from behind. They're of secondary importance. What's more important is the state survival under international anarchy. If you remember, neorealist metaphor, had this billiard ball metaphor, if you remember from the last semester. States are like billiard balls, right? Well, they often clash against each other, like power politics. The only difference among billiard balls is cosmetic difference, right? Their colors are different, their numbers are different, but their shape and their weight are the same. Therefore, their function is the same. Therefore, all these domestic dynamics, they come of secondary importance. They come from behind. The most important thing is, well, the billiard table, actually, they are operating the international anarchy that under which they are trying to survive through power politics. And Kenneth Walsh, I'm quoting, domestic differences between Great Britain, for instance, and United States had little impact on their foreign policy behavior. Under tuning, not undermining, but the de-emphasizing the importance of domestic factors because of the existence of international anarchy. On the contrary, neoclassical realism kind of believes that, well, this is where neorealism failed in its effort to predict world politics in the post-Cold War era. Well, therefore, we need to get on board the new factors, domestic factors, to better explain world politics from a realist perspective. Okay, so therefore, neoclassical realism places primacy on the international system and relative material capabilities of states' personalities. Therefore, international system is important, yes. Anarchic international system is maybe the most important factor. Okay, they kind of admit that. But they also say that domestic factors are also important in international relations. I'm going to go into more details about that. First off, well, although Kenneth Walsh is known for the most important, the most prominent neorealist scholar in the history of international relations, His first book, derived from his PhD dissertation, entitled Man, State, and War, published in 1959, well, it talks about three images, the three levels at which international relations might be explained, okay? So the man referring to domestic level, individual level, man, of course, individuals, state meaning domestic level, the state level, and war meaning the systemic level, international system, okay? Waltz, when he wrote about that, he talks about all these three images, three levels, which had somewhat, influential in explaining international relations, explaining wars, explaining order, and so on and so forth in international relations. But then in 20 years later, he wrote his prominent book, Theory of International Politics, in 1979, which mainly focuses on the international system, the third image, okay? Kind of dismissing the first two images. And then we see that neorealism flourishes upon this claim to emphasize international system and while de-emphasize other factors. But classical realism, as we all know, stems from the very idea that human nature is evil, meaning that they are actually investing on the first image, the individual factors. Because individual is, its nature is evil, then international system will be anarchic and the power politics will be inevitable. Therefore, the conflict will be inevitable. Long story short, what neoclassical realism aims to accomplish is to incorporate the assumptions of classical realism and neoclassical realism, okay? Bring them together. That's why it calls itself neoclassical realism in the first place. Therefore, they are using all these three images outlined by Kenneth Waltz in late 1950s to have a broader, has a better explanatory capacity for the realism. So the first image, individual level, second image, state level, and the third image, international systemic level. So incorporating the domestic, the individual factors, the domestic, the state level factors, and then the third image of neorealism, systemic factors. In that regard, I'm going to ask you, which image the domestic or individual factors refer to. So whether, for instance, leaders' perceptions or misperceptions. Is it the first image or a second image, for instance? Is it an individual first image or a state or domestic level second image? Leaders' misperceptions. So this might be an important factor for neoclassical realism to understand the variations, the differences in state behavior in their efforts to respond to international anarchy. Okay, this is, of course, an individual level. Therefore, it is a first image explanation of, or a first image example. The strategic cultures of states. Therefore, state level, the second image. Political identities. Well, we can say political identity of a leader, of an individual. Therefore, first image, we can say. Or political identity of a government or a state, right? Political culture. Then we can say state level, the second image. Domestic political regimes, domestic political institutions, they all refer to state level examples. State-society relations, domestic economic constraints, capabilities or lack of capabilities. In economic, political, and military sense, they all refer to state level factors. And of course, perceived lessons of the past. These are new things that neoclassical realism brings forward into the agenda of realism when it comes to explaining international relations. Perceived lessons of the past, well, since individuals, they kind of pursue and try to learn from their past mistakes, we can say individual level, or first image explanation, or the example for first image will be in order. Do you see any resemblance to constructivism or neoliberalism in that sense? Because they tend to take on board almost everything that neorealism readily dismisses.
It's similar with constructivism,
yeah,
with its emphasis on perceptions and identities, and similar with neoliberal theory with regimes and political institutions.
Definitely, excellent, excellent, Emre. So we see a resemblance in that, in the sense that neoclassical realists talk about culture, identity, and also perceptions, also the perceived lessons of the past, leader's mind. Okay, so we can see the similarity. Well, they don't necessarily hold as similarities. We can say neoclassical realists kind of borrow those terms from constructivism. But I'm going to be talking about later when we are dealing with criticisms against neoclassical realism. That actually those similarities are not necessarily the case. Well, because constructivists blame neoclassical realists of abusing or instrumentalizing those concepts for the sake of explaining state behavior, which are trying to survive under anarchy. I'm going to be talking about that. So the constructivists criticize neoclassical realists of instrumentalizing these terms without necessarily questioning them, problematizing them. Well, because as you all know, constructivism tends to problematize those terms, as well as other post-positivist theories. Similarity with neoliberal theory, yes, economic factors, right? Institutions, political regimes. Well, regime types. So neoliberal theory might be winking, right? So there might be some similarities, or borrowing terms again from neoliberal theory in that regard. Well, and that's also part of the reason why realists don't necessarily like neoclassical realists. The broader focus, broader vision, incorporated almost every factor in order to, have a claim to better explain international relations. And, in 2017, I was in a conference in Baltimore, and John Mearsheimer, you all know, very prominent offensive neorealist professor, and they asked about his opinion, concerning neoclassical realism. What do you think about it? And he calls it an abomination. Hilkat garibisi. He doesn't like it. Well, he says they try to incorporate everything to explain, but at the end of the day, it becomes much more complex, and it has less capacity to explain the phenomena. Okay. But regardless, domestic factors and individual factors are the main focus on neoclassical realism, with the claim to better explain international politics in the new era. And they believe that neorealism actually failed to do so. So they are willing to pick up where neorealism left off, and they try to offer a better explanation to world politics in order to increase their explanatory capacity. And I like this, equation formulation for neoclassical realism. They say that states do not always perceive systemic incentives or threats similarly. What do we mean by this? Well, although every state operates under international anarchy, well, they don't necessarily have the same perceptions towards the systemic pressures, okay? Sometimes a state might perceive a systemic pressure as an opportunity, but some others might perceive the same pressures as a threat, okay? Therefore, based on the differences in their perceptions, their actions might differ. Well, the second point is that even if they do perceive the systemic pressure in a similar way, like, both as a threat or as an incentive or as an opportunity, well, they don't always act rationally or similarly. If you remember from the last semester, well, because of the leader's, for instance, cognitive limitations, the leader's personality, or the lack of domestic capabilities. Okay, so even if they pursue systemic pressures in the same way, they sometimes fail to respond in a similar way. Well, because of, for instance, from a first image explanation from individual factors, that leaders might, I don't know, have other things to worry about. Maybe in their mind, the priority should be given to another issue. Therefore, they don't necessarily act in the same way as other countries, for instance, or they don't have the capacity to do so. Well, they don't have the military power to respond, for instance. They don't have the military capacity to have a balancing behavior against the threatening force. So what do? They fail to act decisively, unlike other countries. Therefore, the difference between neorealism and neoclassical realism definitely essentially lies in the domestic capacities, domestic perceptions, individual perceptions, and the domestic capacities. If they don't have the power, well, how can they respond to the very same pressures coming from international anarchy? This is the main logic behind neoclassical realism. And the third point that was highlighted by neoclassical realism is international system. Of course, it is anarchic, right? Yes, we all get that, but they believe that international system doesn't always present clear signals about threats and opportunities. Sometimes it is clouded, sometimes it's unclear. It is really difficult to understand or to read it. Okay, even if it does, as I told you before, even if the international system sends clear signals, like Zeus, lightning strike, chain lightning. Okay, it's very self-explanatory. Okay, kafamıza yıldırım yiyeceğiz. All right, so we see the threat, but domestic economic and political limitations do not always let states quickly mobilize their forces and respond to international threats or opportunities. Therefore, the domestic factors are really important on how they respond to international anarchy. Therefore, the overall argument, the main conclusion of neoclassical realism is states respond to the pressures of the anarchic international system, yes, but how they respond is rather determined by domestic factors, i.e. the individual factors and the state level factors, okay? So in the first phrase, they think very similar to neo-realist ideas. States respond to the pressures of anarchic international system, okay? Similarity, the same thing. They're on the same board with neo-realists, but in the second sentence, they differentiate. They become a distinct phenomena from neo-realists. How they respond to international anarchy is much more dependent on their individual and state level factors, okay? i.e. domestic factors. And as I told you, they focus on differences in perceptions. Okay, so borrowing the terms from constructivism, for instance, but of course in their own way. So differences in perceptions or misperceptions or different interpretations of systemic pressures make you react to them differently. Randall Schweller, one of the prominent neoclassical realists, says that states often react differently to similar systemic pressures, well, because of the differences in their perceptions. Therefore, not all states give the same response to international anarchy or the external developments perpetrated by international anarchy. You guys all remember the term balance of power, right? Forming temporary alliances against a powerful state. The main idea, the main neorealist logic behind balance of power is that the anarchy leads to mistrust. Therefore, you cannot trust anyone. Therefore, the permanent alliance, permanent partnership is impossible. You cannot trust anyone in the long term. What you can do is to have a balancing behavior, temporary partnership with other countries to stand against a bigger enemy. Therefore, balance of power seeks to reach stability, power equality, power equilibrium. Kind of in order to reach a stability through an even distribution of power among states, just like in scales, as you can see from the picture. However, neoclassical realists would say, well, we need to refine the term balance of power because the existence, the mere existence of physical power is not necessarily enough to explain variations in state behaviors. Okay? Just because you are very powerful, your neighbors are not supposed to form a balance of power, balancing alliance against you. Okay? This is not an automatic. This is not a kind of an out of question. It's not a given proposition. There is more than meets the eye. And they offer the term balance of threat as an alternative strategy. Okay? Stephen Wolf, the man on the photo, wrote a seminal article in 1985. Although, okay, this is actually written before the term neoclassical realism was introduced, but still, the logic is similar. He says, threat perceptions matter in foreign policy, in international relations. Okay? So the aggressive intentions, saldırgan düşünceler. Aggressive intentions are more alarming than power capabilities. So Turkey doesn't necessarily prepare for forming alliance against Britain just because Britain has important, nuclear capabilities or so. But, well, because it doesn't feel directly threatened by British military capabilities. But it might do so against another opponent, like North Korea, which is in comparison is much less powerful than Britain, but Turkey, if it perceives a threat from North Korea's nuclear capabilities, then it forms a temporary partnership with other countries to balance, to intimidate, to deter North Korea from preventing it from attacking Turkey. Okay?
Can I ask something?
Sure, Emre.
Can we evaluate it within the framework of brute fact and social fact of constructivism?
Yeah, but when it sounds like that, we might kind of confound neoclassical realism and constructivism? Well, yes, we can say, we can think for starters, yeah, well, there are similarities. But the problem is, their agendas, their objectives are different. Okay, they both talk about the threat perceptions, which might determine your actions. But the main agenda, the main objective of constructivism is to problematize, is to the question, okay, the givenness of international relations that realists visualize in their minds. However, neoclassical realists, they don't necessarily question almost anything in international. They take, for instance, international anarchy as given. They don't necessarily question it. But they say, well, the leaders' threat perceptions differ. How about your perceptions towards anarchy? Okay, don't they differ? As proposed by Alexander Wendt. So they don't actually talk about it. They don't, well, because, I don't know, it doesn't suit their interests, in a sense. Therefore, well, they don't want to complicate it. They just add a new dimension to better explain state behaviors. Therefore, they instrumentalize the term perception rather than use it as an important research tool to problematize, to question what has already been taken as given, as a kind of law-like situation like anarchy. So their objectives are really different. That's why constructivists, they harshly criticize neoclassical realism as instrumentalizing those very concepts, such as perceptions, threat perceptions, so on and so forth, in order to fit the bill, to better explain world politics, to reinvigorate, to resuscitate, to resurrect the neo-realist assumptions. Anlatabiliyor muyum? Yani aslında böyle biraz araçsallaştırıyorlar. Yani çok benziyormuş gibi görünüyor ama amaçları farklı. Konstruktivistler amaçları devletlerin işte yaklaşımlarını daha iyi açıklayalım diye değil. Zaten onların davranışlarını açıklayan teorik yaklaşımları aslında sorunsallaştırıyorlar. Onları eleştirmek için kullanıyorlar. Yani onların amaçları işte problem solving teori olmak değil. Hatırlayın. Problem solving theory versus critical theory. Ama neoclassical realism is very much a problem solving theory. Well, because it sees the gaps in the neo-realist paradigm and they want to fix those problems. Okay, acting as a problem-solving theory. Therefore, welcoming new initiatives, new terms as threat perception, so on and so forth, which is that, you know, which those concepts we are used to hearing from constructivism and, you know, and other post-positivist theories, but they kind of instrumentalize it to fix the problem, acting as a problem-solving theory. Okay, but constructivists, well, they don't have such a concern. Well, because in the first place, they don't act as a problem-solving theory. They don't claim to be. Their only objective is to problematize the international system and the theories assigned, just like neorealism and neoliberalism, in order to offer an explanation to international relations. Okay, so we can say yes, on the surface, it looks as if they're similar, but their agendas, their objectives are different. Okay, so realists or neoclassical realists, they try to use it in order to better understand the world politics, better explain it, acting as a problem-solving theory. Okay, they don't problematize it, they don't question it. They just say, okay, well, it works as an instrumental medium for me to better compare two phenomena. Not more than that. At the end of the day, they all respond to international anarchy, neoclassical realists. This is the main conundrum, actually, unfortunately, in the eyes of constructivists. Anyway, back to balance of threat. Therefore, they say the mere capabilities, physical capabilities, don't necessarily trigger balancing behavior. At the same time, those countries with power capabilities should also be threatening others, forcing them to resort to balancing capability. That's why they call it balance of threat. Okay, so different threat perceptions might lead to different state behaviors. For instance, this is one of my favorite examples, which we wrote with Dilek Barlas Hoca from Koç University in 2018 to better understand why Turkey and Britain in the 1930s formed a partnership despite having different threat perceptions or different, the enemies. Anyway, they didn't have a common enemy. So state might have different threat perceptions towards the same state. Therefore, their policy towards that state might be different. Okay. In that case, the very power capabilities of that state becomes of lesser importance. More important is the threat perceptions or the aggressive intentions of that state perceived by the others. The example, the Turkish threat perceptions towards Nazi Germany and fascist Italy in the 1930s, okay, they were very different in comparison to the British threat perceptions towards the very same two countries. In that regard, Britain was mainly disturbed by the revisionist policies of Germany. Therefore, Britain considered Italy as a lesser evil to be used to balance Germany, okay? But on the other hand, Turkey was mainly threatened by Italy. Well, because although Germany in physical strength had much more power capabilities than Italy, it didn't constitute as a direct threat to Turkey. However, Italy constituted a direct threat. Well, because its aggressive intentions in the Mediterranean, you all know the story from last year's Turkish Foreign Policy course. And while Turkey viewed Germany as a distant threat, well, because it was not necessarily considering Mediterranean in its #1 agenda, but rather focusing on the Eastern Europe. Therefore, it was a distant threat for Turkey not to worry about immediately. The immediate threat was Italy. Although it was less powerful than Germany, well, it became much more threatening for Turkey. Therefore, their threat perceptions were different. That's why their acts were different. Their actions were different. Okay? So Turkey tried to form alliances, balancing behavior against Italy, but not Germany. On the contrary, Britain tried to form a balancing bloc, but failed, but still it tried to form a balancing bloc against Germany, okay? So opposite threat perceptions had an opposite impact in their approaches to those states. And Randall Schweller, as I told you before, one of the prominent names, he wrote 2 books in 2004 and 2006 to offer new terms to the neoclassical realism literature under the names of underbalancing and overbalancing. Okay, so balance of threat, balance of power. Okay, we understood that, the differences between the two. But he also introduced something new. Depending on the perceptions or the misperceptions of states in their threat assessments against other countries, okay? And the domestic constraints, domestic problems, lack of domestic capabilities. So the first image, first level explanation is your threat perception. And the second image explanation is your capacity, your economic, political, military capacity to answer to threats, okay? So Randall Schweller says that we can explain whether a state can or cannot form a balancing behavior towards a threatening force due to domestic and individual factors under the names of underbalancing and overbalancing. Overbalancing means if you believe that the state A poses a big threat for you, then you start to overreact against it, right? So you try to form alliances very deliriously. Try to ally with anyone you can in order to deter a threatening power. Just like Turkey did. In my analysis, I believe that Turkey during the 1930s resorted to overbalancing against Italy. Tried to establish regional and Europe-wide partnership between, with almost everyone, like Sadabad Pact, the Balkan Pact, regional level, and also at Europe-wide, try to establish partnership with almost everyone except for Italy. Okay, well, because the number one threat in the eyes of Turkish decision makers was the Italian threat, but not necessarily against Germany. Underbalancing is the opposite. So if you believe that state A doesn't pose a big threat for you, so you don't necessarily resort to balancing behavior. Or, as I told you at the beginning of examples, you actually perceive such a huge threat from state A, but you don't have the capacity to pursue power politics against that threatening force. Then what you do? Well, you resort to underbalancing. Okay, so which equates to doing almost nothing, or lack of capabilities forces you to, for instance, appeasement policy. We can consider appeasement policy of Britain and France against Hitler in the 1930s, later stages, as examples of underbalancing, because the world economic crisis shattered the economy of those two Western powers, and they were not ready to stand against Germany. What they did, they delayed the inevitable by offering some alternative solutions, the palliative, we say, the short-term privileges, concessions to Hitler in order to prevent him from turning this into a huge charade. But unfortunately, the opposite happened, leading to Second World War. Okay, so underbalancing, lack of decisive power politics behavior. Either you don't have enough threat perceptions, or you don't have enough physical capabilities to do so. And Shivaler says, when a state underbalances, it either misperceives the intentions of the rising power as more benign than they actually are, or it correctly perceives the threat, but it does not adopt prudent policies to protect itself for reasons of domestic politics. So the lack of domestic economic, political, and military capabilities. And I'm kind of repeating myself. Turkey and Britain, in comparison, in the 1930s. Therefore, with this idea, with this argument in mind, I claim that Turkey resorted to overbalancing against Italy and underbalancing against Germany because of these threat perceptions. Okay, so this was the domestic lack of domestic capabilities came in secondary importance for the Turkish case. In my analysis, the threat perceptions played a larger part in explaining Turkey's behavior at that time. And for the British case, yes, underbalancing against both Italy and Germany, well, because the threat perception was dictating that Germany was the bigger evil, Italy was the lesser evil, yes. But the problem was that the domestic factors, the lack of capacities for the British economy, politics, and military prevented them from taking decisive action against Germany. Therefore, they appeased rather than balanced Germany. There is also the term called the cult of the offensive. Stephen Van Evera talks about this. Misperception. He talks about the misperception that the attack is the best defense. So Fatih Terim tactics. Yeah. Attack is the best defense. Well, this misperception, according to Van Evera, leads to both First and the Second World War. Due to advances in military technology, wars will be short and victory will be quick. There is this Schlieffen plan. During the First World War, the German commander, okay, kind of believed that if we quickly, defeat France in a war, then we can turn to Russia and defeat it. Just like that. Well, maybe on paper you can say, well, you're too powerful, you underestimate your opponent, overestimate your capabilities. Misperception, just like in the foreign policy analysis class, right? Cognitive limitations, stereotypical images, so on and so forth, overestimating your capacities, underestimating your opponents. But this, unfortunately, according to Van Evera, led to the Great Wars. Rather than balancing under international anarchy, he says, states chose to fight out of the misperception that it would be a quick win. So we can see the similar logic behind the start of the First World War, the Second World War, right? Also the Stalingrad, which Hitler thought that it would be a quick win. He didn't even assign troops to have their winter clothing at the start of their campaign, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was a disaster, we all know, but they overestimated their capabilities and underestimated their weaknesses and underestimated their opponent. Therefore, the cult of the offensive, if you strike first, then you have a quick win. Right? Misperception. And neoclassical realism actually is introduced by the scholars as a kind of a medium establishing or the bridging between international relations and foreign policy analysis, okay? One of the first foreign policy IR theories to date. So it is more interested in explaining foreign policy behavior of states than neorealists would do so. Neorealists are very much interested in the big questions. War happens, right? How international order, war, and peace can be, explained, so on and so forth. But in the case of neoclassical realism, they are more geared towards explaining certain state behaviors. Therefore, we can trace similarities or the aspiration of neoclassical realism to be considered as a foreign policy theory. Neorealism doesn't see much point in focusing on foreign policies, as I told you, because of the very existence of international anarchy. It is pointless, according to neorealism, to focus on domestic determinants of foreign policy behaviors of states. So the individual examples wouldn't necessarily help us generalize, because their main idea is to make generalizations about world politics. That's why they're looking from the state level, from the systemic level. But neoclassical realism believes that foreign policy decisions are made by human beings. We see similarities between foreign policy analysis scholars in this. They are made by human beings, political leaders and elites, who are constrained by domestic politics and state-society relations, or who are constrained by their personal cognitive limitations. Therefore, international anarchy is not the only factor in IR, according to neoclassical realism. On a final note, of course, We see criticisms in the literature against neoclassical realism. So upon their introduction, almost from every angle, they suffered criticisms, of course. So it is criticized as a post hoc effort to explain the anomalies of neorealism by making use of whatever tools are necessary to plug the holes of a sinking ship. Ryan Rathbun, I'm quoting his book. Meaning that bringing on board almost every determining factor, every feature, in order to claim that, well, I'm explaining better now the word politics. Okay? But the more fine-grained, the more detailed your analytical structure is, the less explanatory power you have. Neorealists criticize as such, okay? So Mearsheimer says neorealism is a simple theory. It is a simple theory, well, because it kind of simply explains everything without necessarily going into too much detail, okay? That's why he calls it parsimonious theory, parsimonious. Okay? It doesn't mean that it is simple, it is the simplicity of neorealism, according to Mearsheimer, makes it very strong. But the more detailed, the more composite your arguments become, the less understandable and less explanatory, less parsimonious they become, and less explanatory they eventually will be. And therefore, their explanatory power will decrease. Okay? So this eclecticism of neoclassical realism is criticized by neorealists. Also, constructivists, as I told you at the beginning, very much emphasized and criticized neoclassical realism by instrumentalizing the very terms that they use, like perceptions, identity, culture, without necessarily questioning, problematizing the term. They are kind of using, hani kullanışlı aptallar denir ya, they're kind of using instrumentally to refine their explanation of world politics and state behavior under memory, using identity and perceptions for practical reasons, therefore, for better explaining differing state behaviors under similar conditions. So they don't necessarily question international anarchy. They take international anarchy as a physical reality, unchanging physical reality. How about my perception of anarchy? Is it the same or does it differ? If so, what happens then? So neoclassical realism doesn't necessarily talk about. And this is where constructivists would criticize. Okay? And neoclassical realism is also criticized by FPA scholars, foreign policy analysis scholars. Well, because as I told you, it also claims to become an foreign policy theory. Establishing bridge between IR theory and foreign policy analysis, it says. But FPA scholars stand against this. Well, because they say, well, using the arguments of FPA without actually offering a detailed perspective on individual or group decision-making factors. Again, from a foreign policy analysis factor, the neoclassical realists are criticized for instrumentalizing individual and domestic factors, state-level factors, without necessarily discussing them in detail in an analytical way, to offer analytical tools to better explain. Okay? All right, well, this is all for today, neoclassical realism. And if you have any questions, floor is yours, you guys.
I have actually. I hope I can express well. I have a question about overbalancing and underbalancing issues. For some examples, there is bad results. For example, Germany attacked Britain, so we can say Britain underbalanced Germany. But for some example, there is no bad result. For example, Turkey is underbalancing Germany or overbalancing Italy. So how can we evaluate it? How can we analyze it without any visible and brute results? Wouldn't that be too subjective?
Yes, well, it might be, but I don't believe that your underbalancing should necessarily lead to a war situation. Okay, at some point, your underbalancing might turn out to play out well, as I told you. Well, because you're dealing with other threats at the same time in the Turkish case. Okay, so I don't think that under or overbalancing necessarily automatically lead to a war or conflict in every instance. So probably we need to take on board more dynamics, more domestic dynamics. And in the Turkish case, as I told you, well, Turkey was already overbalancing or was already trying to keep the balance against Italy in the first place. And staying away from Germany as much as possible without necessarily bringing Germany into this equation. That's what I interpreted as an underbalancing situation. But it doesn't necessarily have to automatically lead to conflict. Well, at some point, yes, it does, but still. For instance, in my article about Cyprus, I was questioning the changing Cyprus policy of Turkey in the 1950s. And I was saying that, well, eventually this decision led to underbalancing. Although Turkey was supposed to have a decisive, a very strong Cyprus policy to the point of standing against the United States, for instance, but it couldn't. And I consider this as an example of underbalancing. And I was trying to explain the reasons behind this by individual and state level factors. So it doesn't necessarily have to lead to a conflict, but it offers us an analytical tool to better understand and explain why things happen the way they do. All right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a conflict. It can be, I don't know, a lighter decision. It can be a weakness in a state's decision mechanism. It doesn't necessarily have to automatically translate into a conflict. Any more questions?
May I ask a question, but in Turkish, please?
Well, if you like, I'm going to end this session for the live session. Then we come back and you can ask your questions in Turkish, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, guys, thank you very much. I hope this was a fruitful session for everyone. I'm ending the live broadcast and the class here now. I think we are way past 1 hour. Thank you very much for following the class, everyone. See you next week, let's say.